Good afternoon, everybody. Maral Attallah comes to us from our good neighbors to the north, Humboldt State University, where she teaches in the Critical Race, Gender, and Sexuality Department. We don't even have one of those, so this is interesting. Her research focuses on identity politics, resistance movements, and genocide studies. She created a very popular course at Humboldt entitled Narrating Genocide, and she's currently developing a course focused on the experiences of female resistors during genocide and mass atrocities. As the granddaughter of an Armenian genocide survivor, Maral's research focuses on that genocide with an emphasis on resistance and combating genocide denial. Maral has been awarded fellowships from several prominent institutions, including the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, the Cohen Center for Holocaust and Genocide Studies, and the Holocaust Educational Foundation of Northwestern University. She speaks to us today of the Armenian Genocide, Legacies of Denial. Please welcome Maral Attallah.
Oh, no. Does this work? Can you hear me? All right. Whoa, let's work with it. Bring it down a little bit. Okay. How are y'all doing? Excellent. Thanks for showing up on a Tuesday evening for 2 hours, right? I won't go that long. To talk about genocide. It's a steep. What else could you do on a Tuesday, right? But this is an important talk, and I am so thankful to be here. I want to thank Diane. I want to thank the center for inviting me. You know, my students always say, in my class, my narrating genocide class, you know, we meet for 3 hours once a week. And when you have a classroom at full capacity, from the beginning of the semester to the end of the semester, I think it's more a testament to the students than necessarily the instructor, because it's grueling, and many of you know this because you are taking courses right now. I want to give just a quick shout out to Windsor High School. Windsor High School is here, and that's pretty phenomenal in and of itself, in that there are university students and high school students who are kind of seeing what it's like to sit in a university and learn about topics such as this. This is also an opportunity for me to speak in terms of the history of the Armenian Genocide, but also as a daughter or a granddaughter of a survivor. So I take this really seriously. It's, and sometimes it feels kind of like a burden, right? A burden of representation, but it's also a responsibility. Right? It's a responsibility. And so today, the things that I'll be talking about, we're going to cover the heavy stuff, right? Because we kind of have to. But we're also going to talk about the positive end of the spectrum, right? What can we do now with this knowledge? And for those of you who are in your university course and you're taking these courses and you have the opportunity to sit here and listen to speakers, some of them survivors, it is a phenomenal opportunity. And you can't go away from it and you know, say you didn't know. Right? It's what do you do with this knowledge now? You have to do something. In fact, just before coming here, I was checking my email. I didn't want to do it because I didn't want to be bombarded with other stuff. But I got an email from a student of mine who was a foreign exchange student from Australia. And she wrote me and she said, "You probably don't remember me. I took your class on genocide. I'm seeing all this stuff about Syria and what's happening. I'm feeling really overwhelmed. I really don't know what to do, and I thought that you might be the person that could help me. What do I do with all of this?" Right? And of course, I can't write back to her right then and there because I was coming here, right? So sorry. But I am going to get back to her, and I am going to talk about this talk. And I think that it's important to find spaces like this because they're out there. You just have to find them. So thank you for having me. I teach in the Critical Race, Gender, and Sexuality Studies department at Humboldt State. How many of you are like sociology majors? Awesome, there's like one, be proud, put the hand up. You can do this. Tell your parents you know what you're going to do with that degree, right? Who in here is like a biological science major? Look around. That's amazing. I love it. And I love it because oftentimes when I teach my courses in ethnic studies, in particular, that's the pathway that I teach, I have students who, we go through different stages, just like stages in classes where you learn about the Holocaust or you learn about genocides, right? Maybe you go through that stage where you had no idea that these things were even happening or that they happened. So you start getting really kind of emotional, right? And you don't know if you should be upset. You don't really know what to do with that. And so with my students who take these courses and we go through a progression of, now you have all this information, now what do you do with it? You get to a point where sometimes students will say, I want to change my major. And I always say, no, don't do it, right? And you know, probably to the detriment, right? My department's like, stop telling people not to change their major. But I tell my students, don't change your major, keep your major. Why? Why would I say keep your major? And feel free to talk to me. 100%, you take that knowledge, right, into that new arena. So when my students say, I'm taking classes in wildlife and they don't talk about this, we never learned about, you know, the 11 plus indigenous tribes in Humboldt County, right? Indigenous nations, sovereign nations, right? We never learned about this in my forestry class. We should know about this. I'm taking a watersheds class. I should know about this. And I'm like, yes, you should. So take that information into the field, because if you just stay, right? If you're like, oh, I want to be an ethnic studies major, or I want to, you know, whatever major I want to do new, I'm so inspired by it. We already have a whole bunch of folks who are doing that, and that's great. I'm not saying don't do it, but it really kind of warms my heart when I see folks in different majors who say, I should have taken this class my first year, because they're then pushing their departments to take courses like this. And so at Sonoma State, you are incredibly lucky to have a course like this, and not just a course, but the whole center, right? That you get to come and listen to these lectures. So I'm working on not only a course, a new course, but I'm also kind of floating these ideas around denial. And I'm going to work with it a little bit. So I might be reading some things. Generally, I like to walk around, but I might read a little bit. Some of it is going to be narrative, so I have to read it. I haven't memorized it. But other points is going to be when I talk about active denial versus passive denial, right, in relation to types of denial. So we'll get started here. I know that some of you have already learned about the Armenian Genocide. You had the opportunity, maybe some of you, to come listen to the previous lecture, and so I will try to not be redundant, but I also know there's people here that don't necessarily know about the Armenian Genocide. So we'll talk about that, definitely. All right. Okay, so before we get started, there's like 80-second trailer that I'm going to have you watch, and it's called The Armenian Genocide. So can we go ahead and play it? All right, so there were two speakers in that film. The first speaker that you saw, his name is Ronald Sunni, and Ronald Sunni is just a phenomenal individual and scholar. He's written heavily about the Armenian Genocide. His book, They Can Live in the Desert But Nowhere Else, is probably one of the best books I've read in terms of really comprehensive look at the Armenian Genocide. The second speaker that you saw there is Taner Akçam, and Taner Akçam is he is a Turkish German nationalist. He lives in the United States of America. He speaks about the Armenian Genocide, and what you'll see in the lecture, and kind of what maybe you already know, is that it's against the law to denigrate the Turkish nation in Turkey. And so bringing up the Armenian Genocide in Turkey is a pretty good shot that you are going to be probably arrested, charged, and maybe even convicted under Article 301 of the Turkish Penal Code. So Taner Akçam is kind of one of these rare cases of a scholar, a Turkish historian, who's talking about the Armenian Genocide, but is forced to live outside of Turkey in order to do that. And he just came out with a book I don't even have my hands on it yet. And it is Killing Orders, Talat Pasha's Telegrams, and the Armenian Genocide. He calls this the smoking gun. And just reading the preface alone, my mind is blown. Because what he is doing is he's basically saying this should put an end, right? This will show the legitimacy of the telegrams from Talat Pasha. Talat Pasha would be the equivalent of who we would call maybe like the Turkish Hitler, right? One of the architects of the Armenian Genocide. And so this book is, it's pretty phenomenal, even in me just reading the preface of it. So those are two individuals that I wanted to bring your attention to. Also at the end, if you have questions about sources to learn more about the Armenian Genocide, please feel free to ask me. My email will be on the last slide, right? So please feel free to ask me because there's amazing individuals who are doing work right now. I'm really inspired by Kachig Marodian. I believe he was the first first scholar to earn a Ph.D. at Clark University in Armenian Studies, and he is doing phenomenal work. So if we look at the Armenian Genocide, just kind of some key dates. Is it going in and out or? Okay, just some key dates here. If you look at, and you probably can't see, right? So I got this really new, this clicker. I'm kind of excited about it. So I'm gonna use the pointer because I didn't know that there was even a pointer on it. And so I was like practicing in the hotel room. I was like, this is amazing. If I had a cat, I'd be like, this is amazing, right? Okay, I should also say, because I teach such heavy topics, I kind of crack jokes and I'm a little bit sarcastic, so bear with me because it's really hard to sustain yourself, I think, with the material. And so one of the things I say to my students at the end of every class, no matter what class I teach, pretty much every single one, and if I don't say it, they remind me. I tell people to be kind, be well, and do something nice for someone. And so I want to kind of have that in the back of your mind because it's going to be heavy material, and I want you to do something nice for someone, and that someone might be yourself tonight, right, to kind of process this material. So here's a map of the Armenian Genocide, right? Woo! I also want to make it clear here, we call it the Armenian Genocide, but Assyrians, Greek, Chaldeans were also massacred. We talk about the Armenian Genocide in reference to the 1.5 million Armenians, but it is important to note that if you total in the Assyrian population, my grandmother was Assyrian, the Chaldeans and the Greeks, you're looking at 3 million, a little over 3 million estimated numbers during World War I. So one of the things I want to bring your attention to with my pointer, see right above Lebanon in Syria, there's this second cluster. There's two clusters. This second cluster right there, that's Homs, Syria. Homs, Syria. That's where my family's from. That's where my dad is from. And so I'm going to tell you the story of my grandfather's survival, but I want to bring attention to Homs because most of you know what's happening in Syria. Thousands and thousands of years of history, of culture, just shattered, right? Shattered. And so the city of Homs is one of the more famous resistant points in Syria, and it's pretty much leveled. And so I want to bring attention to Homs because my father was born in Homs in 1935. So key dates to remember, just as we're talking here, and this will kind of set us up to learn a little bit more about the Armenian Genocide. You have the 1894 to 1896 Hamidian massacres, right? And so the Hamidian massacres were taking place under the Ottoman Empire from the Sultan, right, was in charge of these massacres. And at this point, you have to realize that in the Ottoman Empire, the Armenians, the Assyrians, the Chaldeans, the Greeks, they're a Christian minority, right, in the Ottoman Empire. They don't follow Islam, they're Christian. In fact, the Armenians were the first, I think, racial ethnic group to officially state that their religion would be Christianity, and that was in 301 AD. So you have a long history of Christianity in the region that didn't really pair up with this idea of an Ottoman Empire. Eventually you'd hear the term a Turkey for the Turks, right? Armenians may have been Ottoman citizens, but they weren't really considered Ottoman. So with the Hamidian massacres, you have a situation where Armenians were saying, hey, we want equal access to equal resources. We don't want to have to pay extra taxes. We want to have freedom of movement. And so what you end up having is you have a crackdown on the Armenian population. So between 1894 and 1896, it's estimated that 100,000 to 300,000 Armenians were killed throughout the Ottoman Empire. And this really set the stage to say to Armenians, you have no voice, right? You have no voice. So if you then fast forward to the 1908 coup d'etat via the Young Turks under the Committee of Union and Progress, the Committee of Union and Progress becomes this organization where they say, we want to remove the Sultan and his authoritarian powers, right? We have a constitution, we don't feel like it's being followed. We want this new constitutional republic. And so what ends up happening is you have an overthrow of the Sultan. In 1909, you have the Adana massacres. Again, Armenians and Assyrians take a huge hit in the Adana massacres because what ends up happening is you have followers of the Sultan who say, we don't want him to lose his power. And so what do? They go and they attack the Christians, right? The Christian minority. So again, throughout the Ottoman Empire, but specifically here in Adana, we see casualties really of mass proportion. It's estimated that about 30,000 people were killed. In 1913, you have a faction of the Committee of Union and Progress who they're really these ethnic nationalists who they want that Turkey for the Turks, right? And they say, hey, we don't like the folks who are in power, and so you have another coup d'etat, right? And I should mention that when you have the 1908, at the 1908 point, Armenians were very, very kind of excited at what was to come, right? Because there was this promise that everyone would, have equity, that, it would be this united Turkey. And what I think the Christians didn't realize is that united Turkey never included the Christian minorities. But still staunchly supporting the Ottoman Empire. So if you go back to the 1913 faction where they staged this coup d'etat, this is where you're going to see the powers of Talat Pasha and Ver Pasha and Jamal Pasha. They're known as the three Pashas. And these three individuals are the orchestrators of the Armenian Genocide, what we would know as the Armenian Genocide between 1915 and 1923. You have a situation where I think it's really important to note that all of these moments are never without contention, right? So throughout even this lecture and everything that you learn about in your courses, these moments are never without contention. There are always individuals who stand up and they say, and they would otherwise benefit, right, from the status quo. So there's Turks who are saying, we don't agree with this policy against the Armenians. So it's never without contentions. There's always resistance, and there's always upstanders. So the April 24th, 1915 is a really significant date. Does anyone know why it's a really significant date? It's like huge, right? Yeah, please. Correct, right? So have y'all ever heard of the song, and I'll repeat it, have y'all ever heard of the song, Istanbul was Constantinople, now it's Istanbul, not Constantinople. Nobody knows but the Turks. Think about that for a second, right? So the capital used to be Constantinople, and so what your colleague said was, this was the day that all the intellectuals in Constantinople were rounded up, essentially kidnapped, right? Taken from the area and essentially murdered, right? This is a really big point in the commemoration of the Armenian Genocide, because what you end up doing is you see that this is planned, this is organized, right? The first folks that you're going to want to target are going to be the individuals who can motivate people, who can mobilize people, who can educate people. And so you have a targeting on this night. This is, for Armenians, it's the equivalent of the Kristallnacht for the Jews, right? That this is the day where we say, specifically Armenians, we see that they were targeted, right? So with this, you have to know that there's, not just the intellectuals, but prominent Armenians. There's doctors, there's lawyers who are rounded up. They're arrested, like I said. We don't see them again. The Ottoman state isn't just authorizing the deportations and killings during the during the Armenian Genocide, right? But they're also confiscating property. So they're not just rounding people up. They're not just killing people, but they're confiscating property belonging to Armenians. And they're doing this under legal rule, right? So one of the things that you have to understand is because this is an organized event, right? You have to be able to justify yourself. And so you have legal documents that are put forth that are saying the Armenians are going to be removed for their own safety, specifically, use my little pointer, Armenians up here, right? Because at this point in 1914, we already have the Ottoman Empire entering World War I, right, on the side of Germany. And the argument is that those Armenians, those Christian Armenians, are going to side with their Christian neighbors, the Russians. And they're going to side against the Ottoman Empire. So the argument is we need to relocate them for their own safety. It's really important to note, Turks were not relocated. Kurds were not relocated. Armenians, Assyrians, Greeks are being relocated, right? So keeping that in mind, this is under legal precedent. And this idea that Armenians have to list all of their belongings. If Armenians don't come back to get their belongings, what do you think happens? They go to the state. All the while knowing Armenians were never going to come back for their properties because they weren't just being relocated to other areas, they were being sent either to areas where they were killed or they were being sent out into the desert where they were marched in circles and then died. They were marched into the desert into caravans, and my grandfather was one of the individuals who was marched into the Syrian desert on this caravan. And I want you to try to picture it, okay? Because when we talk about the desert, we're not talking about, oh, spring break, we're going to Vegas, and we got to drive through Death Valley, and it's hot, and so I have to have my air conditioning on, right? We are talking the Syrian desert, right? In the day, it is extremely hot. At night, it is extremely cold. And these are individuals who are being marched by foot into the desert with whatever they can carry on their back. And that was probably a slippage of the tongue, right, into the devil. While this is taking place, and I'm just going to kind of fast forward through it because I'm sure you already know about, for the majority of you, you know about all of the events that were kind of taking place, right? The fact that you have men who were conscripted into the Ottoman army. They were disarmed, right? They were removed from their battalions. So you also have civilian populations who were disarmed, right? And that's kind of crazy too because there's all these plans, right? So when they would try to remove the men in the military, families wouldn't hear from them, and so they would be looking for their son. And so what the Ottomans would say back is they'd say, well, maybe they were captured, or, if we, have all these weapons, if we can provide these weapons, we can do exchanges and whatnot. So what do you end up having? You have Armenians who have firearms, Armenians who don't have firearms, asking their neighbor for a firearm, and then coming, right, meet to the town square, and so they come to the town square. And then what happens? Look at your neighbors. Did you know they had all these firearms? Why would they have them if they weren't planning on using them? This again, right, goes to the larger story to put whether it's a real threat, right, or a perceived threat, the Armenians are a threat. And this helps to justify that statement, right? Because then you had neighbors, Turkish neighbors, who were like, I never knew that they owned that many rifles. Like, why would they? They don't, right? They're, he's a cobbler. He works on shoes. Like, why would he need that? Also, during the Armenian Genocide, it is important to note the technology that was used, right? So you have the two main ones, I think that's really important. You have the telegram, which is like, our present day, you get to text folks and then send that information really quick. You have the telegram, and you also have the use of railway cards, right? Cars. So, the images that are usually seen during the Holocaust of folks who are being loaded into rail cars, this is happening decades earlier with the Armenians in a similar way, a really grotesque way. Some Armenians were even told, right, you have to buy your ticket onto this rail car, right? When you get to your destination, it'll be, there'll be something waiting for you, there'll be land, you'll be safe. So you have Armenians who bought tickets literally to their death, in the same way that this happened during the Holocaust. In fact, not only did the individual who coined the term genocide, I'm sure you know this, Raphael Lemkin, he mentions the Armenian Genocide as kind of a precedent for creating this term. Raphael Lemkin lost the majority of his family in the Holocaust. A really great documentary, if you have the opportunity to watch, if you have Netflix maybe, a really great documentary is Watchers of the Sky. It is an incredible documentary. I show it to my students. And so Raphael Lemkin, he coins this term and he mentions the Armenians. He says it's happened many times before, right? It happened to the Armenians, right? So the man who coins the term states it, but you also have Hitler, right? On the eve of invading Poland in 1939, right? Some of his generals were like, can we do this? Are we gonna get away with it, right? And he gives this speech because Hitler was a wonderful orator. He was a motivator, right? And he said, and I'm going to paraphrase here, to kill without pity or mercy all men, women, and children of Polish descent. After all, who today remembers the annihilation of the Armenians? This is in 1939, right? After all, who today remembers the annihilation of the Armenians? Meaning, we'll get away with it. Maybe, yeah, they had these trials. Those folks ended up getting off, if they didn't end up escaping, right? Who today remembers the Armenians? There's actually do you call it a GIF? I don't know. Those little pictures that move, right? There's an outline of supposed to be Talat Pasha, 1915, and then Hitler, right? And it says, if you recognized this, the other wouldn't have happened. I think that's a really simplistic kind of statement to make, but I do think that it speaks to the importance of recognizing genocide. Hitler's literally telling you what he's about to do, right? And we have this knowledge. So the world knows, right? The world knew what was happening between 1915 and 1923. Between 1915 and 1923, over 200 articles are published in the New York Times alone. And so you'll see here, I pulled up one script. It says 500,000 Armenians said to have perished. Now, you're going to notice that it doesn't say genocide because the term wasn't coined until the term wasn't coined until 1944, right? Raphael Lemkin didn't coin it until 1944. He actually started working on it in 1933 with his Madrid proposals. The term genocide, he coins it, right, in 44, in 48, right, you have the acceptance of this term as part of the genocide prevention, right, and the prevention and crime and the punishment of genocide. That's in 48. It took the United States 40 years to ratify the Genocide Convention, essentially saying, we won't commit genocide. We'll hold other people, right, accountable for genocide. Why do you think it took the United States 40 years to ratify, to sign off on the Genocide Convention? Yeah. Exactly. Not only because we committed genocide already, right? We were still in the processes of genocide against various groups. So there's multiple genocides on this land, on this soil. And I would say to you, you're on a university campus. There's a plethora of information available to you, but even if you're not, you can Google it, right? You live in Sonoma. There's the Pomo Indians that are part of Sonoma, right? There's various bands of the Pomo. Look it up. Look at the genocides. And I say genocides because indigenous folks, maybe you use the term Native American, the US uses the term American Indian, and then there's the tribal affiliation. There were multiple genocides committed against multiple indigenous tribes. You can't just say indigenous and it's like one group, like Armenian, right? So keep that in mind, because I think that it's important for us to locate ourselves. So at that point in time, you have the US government going, well, wait a minute. If we ratify this convention, right? And convention in international law, it doesn't mean like a gathering convention. It just means it's a treaty, it's a law, right? If we ratify this treaty, what's that going to mean for us? It took us 40 years. So not only how we treated indigenous folks in this country, right? How did we treat folks of Japanese descent, right, during the internment camps? How do we treat folks of African descent in this country? So all of these questions are coming up. I talk a lot about upstanders in my class, and I think it's important for you to know an individual. His name is William Proxmire. William Proxmire, he was a senator from Wisconsin. And William Proxmire was so upset that the US wasn't ratifying the Genocide Convention. He made this claim. He said, I will stand on the floor of the Senate and I will give a speech until the US government ratifies the convention. 20 years, 3,211 speeches later, the US government ratifies the convention. William Proxmire should be a name that we know. When I went to DC, I was at the information desk and I thought, oh, surely he would be in like the hall where all of the, the famous politicians were, right, and historical figures in the Capitol. And I said, is there a bust of William Proxmire? And she was so sweet to me. She said, honey, who's William Proxmire? I said, well, he's a senator from the great state of Wisconsin, right? Let me look him up, right? Nope, but I guess I could put in a note. And I said, can you please put in a note, because this individual should be known. William Proxmire would be known as an upstander, right? Samantha Power, she uses the term screamer, right? A screamer. Basically because no one is listening to you. No one cares to hear what you have to say. You have to scream it. So I don't know why it keeps doing that. In 1950 alone, right, New York Times articles on the mass murder of the Armenians, there were 140. In 1918, Theodore Roosevelt, and he had his presidency prior to this, right, I think 1901 to 1909, he calls the Armenian massacres the greatest crime of the war. So now let me tell you a little bit about my family. And, okay, we're doing good on time. So let me tell you a little bit about my family. This is the only picture we have of my father's family. And so this handsome gentleman, hold on, no, new clicker, I told you, right? This handsome gentleman right here, look at him, fabulous. This guy, this is my pops. This is Attallah. Attallah. You'll notice that I said I'm a descendant of Armenian genocide survivor, and yet my last name doesn't end in I-A-N or Y-A-N, and there's a reason for it. It's called the Armenian Genocide. Just by the way, William Saroyan, he had this really famous quote, right? When two Armenians meet anywhere in the world, right? Ask me, do they not sing again, pray again, right? Ask me, do they not create a new Armenia? And I think that that's the case. In fact, usually when I give talks, I say, is there any Armenians out there? And people are like, yeah, Armenia. And I'm like, Armenia, right? I'm like, I'm born in Los Angeles, you know what I mean? But like my heart, Armenia is my heart. So the reason why we don't have I-N or Y-A-N is because of the Armenian Genocide. This individual right here, this is my grandfather. This is my grandfather. This is my grandfather, Miriam. Miriam was Assyrian and Armenian. These are my aunts and uncles. The only surviving children are my father. My father just turned 83 years old. He's a professor. He works for the US government. He still works full-time. He teaches full-time. I like to talk a lot about my dad. He's an amazing individual. Sometimes when I talk about him, because I interview him a lot, I do his voice, and my students love it, because he's this little old guy. He's so sweet, and his little accent and they love the little quirky stories about him, because my dad's born in Syria. So, you know, some of the things that we talk about, the nuances in the United States, don't necessarily translate over, but he's a highly intelligent individual. I think he has like 6 degrees. At one point he knew 7 languages. He doesn't use them all as much. And so I tell a lot of stories about my dad. My dad has a really hard time talking about his father. It's not because they had a strained relationship. My dad was the oldest of the children. My dad was very, very close to his father, very close to his mother. My dad has a hard time talking about his father because his father, throughout my dad's life, was dealing with this, what we would now call post-traumatic stress disorder. Right? The tragedy of surviving the Armenian Genocide. So I'll tell you this story as we know it. My grandfather was probably 3 or 4 years old around the time of the Armenian Genocide, 1915, when the deportations were taking place. We have no knowledge, really, where my grandfather is from in Armenia. In fact, when I went to Armenia in 2015, I gave a lecture, and I had gone to the Armenian Genocide Museum, and it was just so much. It was too much for me to take in. In fact, there's a picture that they took of me. And I don't think I look really good in the picture, so I was like, oh, can we delete that, right? But also I think it was important to keep it up because there's a picture I'm looking at, and I kind of have my hand over my face, and it's just so much to take in, and it's hot, right? It's Armenia in the summer, and I'm just crying. But I'm trying to keep it together because I'm there with colleagues. And I remember I saw one name, and it was a name of a doctor who was one of the individuals who were rounded up on April 24th, and his last name was Shilingirian. And the name stood out to me because we have no solid evidence, but through word of mouth, that my grandfather is probably from the Shilingirian family. Now, Armenia was huge, right? If you're a Johnson, it doesn't mean you're related to this Johnson. But I saw that name, I was so moved by that name. And I looked and I thought, could this have been like my grandfather's dad? Could this have been, when I saw the pictures of the children, the Armenian orphans? Thousands. I tried to look at each of their faces. Do their eyes look like mine? I was trying to find some type of connection. My grandfather was probably 3 to 4 years old, like I say. And the story goes like this. He and his sister were the only 2 of his family to survive the infamous death marches into the Syrian desert. Now, if I backtrack, now that you've seen the picture, they ended up here, or at least he ended up here, in Homs. You'll see with the big circles, right, these are massacre sites, right? The arrows indicate death march routes. So you're looking maybe a massacre site here, and then there's a route, there's a death march, right, that led into Lebanon. He ended up somewhere along that route, right here in Homs, Syria. The little black dots indicate concentration camps. When we talk about concentration camps, we think about the Holocaust. There were concentration camps during the Armenian Genocide as well. There are deportation checkpoints as well, right? So my grandfather and his sister, they go out on this march into the Syrian desert. And at one point, the story is that they got to a place where the sister felt my grandfather would be safe. And she was maybe 7 years of age, 8 years of age. She was a little bit older than him. It was her job to take care of him. Some of you can think about the age difference between yourself and your sibling, right? I'm 6 years apart from my sister and brother, right? They would be looking after me. Can you imagine an 8-year-old? And so they get to a point where she feels he can be safe, and she barters him for a loaf of bread so that she can have something to eat and so that they would take him and give him a better life. That's where his sister story ends. There were individuals who later heard about my grandfather and they said, I know him, right? He was part of the Schillingerian family, but at that point in time, you needed at least 2 people to testify. And the family that took him in, the Khalils take my grandfather in. But see, they thought, oh, we'll adopt this kid, right? We'll be really good Christians. Because in Homs, Syria, the Khalils, they were part of a Christian family. And so they said they'd take him in. And then after a few days, they decided, what's wrong with this kid? He's not happy, right? He's causing us too much issues. So they literally put him outside with the trash. After everything he's gone through, you saw how many headlines. People knew what was happening. A family member comes, a cousin comes, he sees my grandfather sitting on the curb outside the house, and he says, what's going on? And he brings my grandfather inside. And he says to the Khalils, he says, are you not a God-fearing people? Do you know not what happened to this Armenian orphan? That you put him on the street? Are you not Christian? And that was enough to shame them into keeping him. But they didn't really love him. My dad says, they raised him up as they would raise a pet. They raised him up as they would raise a pet. And I don't even know if that's like an accurate kind of statement to make, and that like I love my dog, right? Like I probably love my dog more than some human beings. But they raised him up as they would raise a pet. They never gave him the family name. They never gave him the name Khalil. Instead, they gave him one name, Attallah, which in Arabic means gift from God. Attallah. So my grandfather, he's got one name now, right? He's like Cher Madonna, Attallah. So usually it gets like a bigger laugh, right? People are like, oh, right on, you know? So my dad's born, right? And well, one of the things I should say too, when my grandfather, at one point, there were folks that were coming and they were looking for the Armenian orphans so that they could take them back to Armenia. And the family says that when they came to the Khalil family, the Khalils put my grandfather, he was a young boy, they put my grandfather in one of the silos. They hid him. They didn't want to give him back. So that when he grew up and he was told, Attallah, you can go back to Armenia. You can have a little piece of land. Like, it'll be great, right? My grandmother says, we can't go. We can't go. We're Syrian. We speak Arabic. We don't know anyone there. We can't go. And my dad says that for my grandfather, he honored his wife's wishes, but his heart was broken. His heart was broken. I was the first person in my family to actually go to Armenia, not historic Armenia or what Armenians would call occupied Armenia, right? Eastern Turkey. Occupied Armenia, Eastern Turkey. I was the first in my family to go to Armenia. So my grandfather, he gets this name, Attallah, and you're supposed to name your firstborn son after your father. So my father's born, and they give him the name Antun, but they don't have a last name, so our last name becomes Attallah, right? That's how our last name doesn't end in an IN or a YN. And just for kicks, I'll tell you this. My brother's born, he's the firstborn. Follow me here. You name your firstborn after your father. My brother's name is Attallah Attallah. He likes to say he's the guy so nice they named him twice. I say our parents were bored. And you can see how well that goes over, right? Like present day racial profiling, Attallah Attallah, right? It doesn't go over very well, especially when he lived in Arizona. And his skin would get really dark in the summers. And my brother just liked to play with people. And so, he'd be walking down his very bougie neighborhood. He's a banker. And it was a weekend. So he wears like a Adidas sweatsuit, right? He's a product of the 80s. So he's wearing his Adidas sweatsuit, walking his little dog, right? He's got a bandana on, dark skin, full beard. Boo, right? sir, right? He's like, I live in that house. That's my house, right? What's your name? Attallah. What's your last name? Attallah. So this is the story of my grandfather surviving the Armenian Genocide. And because of this survival, this is a story that, these stories that I grew up hearing, it's part of my collective remembering. I use the term collective remembering and not collective memory because it's not my memory, right? It's not my memory. It's memory that I'm remembering. All right, so during genocide, I'm going to kind of go over the basics here before I get into some stories. Y'all are going to like it, I'm sure, these stories. Generally, when there's a Q&A, people are like, so, like, does the FBI know who you are? I'm like, yes, they know who you are too, right? So groups people fall into. And I want to say that these categories are fluid. They're fluid and they're complicated. So I'm just going to list them, right? Perpetrators, victims, rescuers, bystanders, and upstanders. Upstanders might be a term that you don't usually use or you haven't really heard of. My mentor, Dr. Sam Oliner, who, by the way, just had a birthday on Saturday. Sam Oliner's a survivor of the Holocaust. He and his wife, Pearl Oliner, created the Altruistic Personality and Behavior Institute at Humboldt State. And their work really, and he's still working, right? I mean, he's retired, but he's still writing. He's like, I'm working on a book. I said, oh, really? He's like, yeah, but, I don't have an editor yet because I don't want to have to worry about these deadlines, I'm like, okay, Sam. Like, Sam reminds me a lot of my dad, right? And this whole idea that you're supposed to do better than your parents, I already told my dad, like, that's not going to happen. I mean, I speak 2.5 languages if I'm lucky, right? So even there, I'm kind of out of it. But Sam taught me a lot about empathy. And so when I list these groups that people fall into, the first group that I list here is perpetrators, and I want you to have empathy. So let me be clear here. Empathy is not excusing, it's not justifying, it's understanding where someone is coming from. It's understanding why someone does what they do, right? You don't have to like it. You don't have to agree with it. In fact, you probably shouldn't, right? Especially when we're talking about perpetrators of mass atrocity and genocide. But try to understand why folks are in the position that they're in, why they're doing what they're doing. This is not, trying to balance out whatever, harms they're feeling and say, well, this is equal to the harm that they're causing their victim. It's simply asking you to try to understand why people do what they do. So perpetrators, these are the folks, they're not just the killers in genocide, these are the folks who give the orders, right? So the perpetrators, this is micro, macro. These are the folks who are giving orders and the folks who are doing the killing. The victims, these are obviously the folks who are targeted based on their group membership, right? So the Genocide Convention, right? National, racial, ethnic, religious groupings. These are the folks who are targeted for eradication via the state. Rescuers, Sam has spent, a significant part of his adult life and really his academic career looking at the rescuers, because I don't think that you could sustain yourself in this field if you didn't try to find the positive with the negative. So for rescuers can be identified, again, on the micro or the macro level. So they could be the state, right? They could be other governments, they can be organizations, or they could be individual people. These are folks who put everything on the line. They risk everything to bring aid to the victims of genocide. In Sam and Pearl's pretty famous study on altruistic personality, right, they state, if perpetrators and collaborators constitute the tragedy of this human experience, rescuers constitute its hope. Now, bystanders can also be identified on the micro and macro level in relation to individuals and governments. Both types of bystanders are going to stand idly by, whether they're ignorant or willfully ignorant, right? And I think that there's a difference here. I think that there's a difference, right? You're ignorant, you just don't know. You're willfully ignorant, you know, and you choose to do nothing about it. And so I think that behavior kind of lies on a spectrum, just as all of these behaviors can lie on a spectrum. When you're a bystander, Sam says, evil triumphs. Evil triumphs. No one does anything. So keep in mind, indifference kills, right? So, you know, when people sit back and they go, well, I didn't want to get involved, you're still making a choice, right? That's still an action. Upstanders are the folks who call out the perpetrators and the deniers, right? The upstanders are the folks who call them out. And I would argue that we all need to be upstanders. We all need to be upstanders. They bring attention to the cause at hand. And again, these moments are never without contention. These are the folks who are saying, not on my watch, not in my name. Not going to happen. There are various processes to genocide. Y'all probably know about Gregory Stanton and his 10 stages of genocide. I choose to use Kelman's model. He has a basic 5. And I choose to use his model because I just think it's easier to work with. It doesn't mean that I don't think that we shouldn't like pick it apart and say, and this stage can actually be these stages. But I think that it just helps to think about genocide in this light. And I also want to say, just like in the previous one, this isn't stagnant. This isn't set in order, right? So just because denial is at the bottom doesn't mean denial is the final stage of genocide. Denial is taking place throughout. Dehumanization is taking place throughout. There's not one area where you could say, and this is where dehumanization stops, and this is where murder begins, right? I mean, it's happening at the same time. This is well-organized, bureaucratic procedure that's taking place. So just as I said, when you have, the Ottoman Empire entering into World War I in 1914, they're already thinking, right? What are the steps that we can take so that we can have plausible deniability, right? So maybe we don't have, Turkish military or the gendarme going in and killing folks. Maybe we entice the Kurdish population to engage. Because then, after the war or after the event, we can step back and say, well, it was just a dispute amongst these 2 ethnic minorities. It was a civil war, right? Genocide happens under the cover of war. That is strategic. That is planned, right? Because if genocide is taking place under the cover of war, folks are focusing on the war and not necessarily what states, perpetrators are doing to their own people. And if they do bring it to light, right, you can step back and say, well, war is a horrible thing. And most folks will be like, yes, war is a horrible thing, right? So dehumanization of victims, right? This is the scapegoating, and this is one of the first steps I would say that the state takes, right? When Hitler was giving these speeches, he was inciting in a people, a belief system, right, that was already there. Right? This is decades and decades and decades. This is generations of a belief system of anti-Semitism, right? He's okaying it. He's okaying it. People are like, yeah, you're right. Right? So dehumanization, you literally say us and them. I would caution us all in present era, in the United States of America, I would caution us, when we see dehumanization, we have to be upstanders. I tell my students all the time, if we think about dehumanization as dehumanizing, right? Literally, you're not even human. Think about language that's used against people. Authorization of mass murder, you could just even look at authorization. The state authorizes the dehumanization, even if there's laws on the books against it, right? The state turns the other way. Routinization is the well-organized bureaucratic procedure of rounding people up, right? Concentrating people. Do not be fooled. In the United States of America, what we did to folks of Japanese descent, and to a small extent folks of German and Italian descent, and those kidnapped South Americans of Japanese descent that we rarely talk about, right? What we did to those folks during World War II, we rounded people up and we put them, we say what? What do we call them? Internment camps. These are concentration camps. In your studies, you're going to learn, right? when you learn about the Holocaust, you learn about concentration camps. You learn about Auschwitz, right? Auschwitz wasn't just a concentration camp, right? It was also a work camp and a death camp. The difference being is the camps that we see, right, Manzanar, these were work camps, these were concentration camps. In the United States, we didn't have the death camps. It didn't get to that point, right? So I would caution you that when we start using language that dehumanizes people, you are on that path, right? I mean, genocide, think about it in terms of these actions that lie on a spectrum. If genocide is at the far end of the spectrum and altruism and compassion are at the other end of the spectrum, we're all just kind of somewhere. We're all just somewhere. And our goal is to not move towards policies like genocide, to call them out. So when you hear the term like illegal alien, right, or calling someone an alien, that is a dehumanizing term. Etymology, I get it, right? I understand what it means. But when it becomes part of modern parlance, where we so freely can use language that literally dehumanizes a human being, that is part of a process. Murder is pretty self-explanatory. You then have denial, and again, just because denial is at the end doesn't mean that it's like this final stage of genocide, right? This is where the perpetrators deny any involvement. At every single stage, they're denying involvement, right? They're either downplaying the severity of their acts or just denying the acts altogether. I say without recognition of fault, there can be no healing for genocide victims and their descendants. Without recognition, there can be no resolution. So let me repeat that. Without recognition, there can be no resolution. So before we as an international community can even begin to quell the violence raging on in the world today, whether we look at what's taking place in Myanmar, the Central African Republic, Iraq, Syria, Nigeria, right? We have to try to understand our past and look to our past for guidance. So there's types of denial or deniers. Some of you are familiar, you should be familiar, right, with Deborah Lipstadt. Deborah Lipstadt is a seminal professor in the field of Holocaust and Genocide studies. In fact, there was a Hollywood film that was put out a few years ago. I think it was just called Denial, right, where she's challenging, she has to defend herself, right, against accusations that, she was committing defamation against a known genocide, right, Holocaust denier, and she has to go to court, right? So Deborah Lipstadt, she coins these terms hardcore and softcore denial, hardcore and softcore denial. The little yellow ones, right, the active deniers, passive deniers, I'll get to those in a second, but I want to speak a little bit to Deborah Lipstadt. She uses these terms in reference to Holocaust denial and in reference to anti-Semitism. And I just want to be really clear, by no means am I trying to trivialize her work by utilizing them in my own field, because again, I'm a sociologist, and my work specifically when I make these connections, I try to make connections with my background in sociology and ethnic studies and genocide studies. I think it's really important to take an intersectional approach. And no disrespect to any historians here, right? But I often find that when I tell people what field I'm in, all of a sudden there's like, so you're not a historian, right? It's like, there's not an ownership on the field. We all need to be working together, right? Especially when I talk about, the gendered experience of upstanders and resistors. They're like, what? Right? It's like, I'll get back to you when the book's published, right? So hardcore and softcore denial. So she comes up with these terms. She says hardcore denial, right? That's like the overt. That's the it never happened. Never happened. Softcore denial, on the other hand, is going to be where you have folks, they might acknowledge that, say, I'll use the Holocaust for example, that the Holocaust happened, but they're going to say things like, not that many folks died. Not that many Jews were killed. In fact, how do we really know that if Jews died, or other folks died, right? It wasn't from disease, it wasn't from starvation. Remember, there was a war going on, right? That's the softcore denial, right? So she uses the language, she says, using different tactics but the same end goal, softcore and hardcore denial, right? It's basically, we're at a point right now where if you deny the Holocaust, you're an outlier, right? I mean, most folks are going to look at you and they're going to be like, have you read a book, right? Have you, like, what's going on, right? Where are you from? Like, what's happening? So most folks know, especially if they're academics, you have to kind of cloud it, right? You cloud it a little bit. You give some plausibility that it could have been something else. In fact, I would argue, not just in the United States, but in the United States, we love to say people should have the right to debate these things. You have your say, I have my say, we can agree to disagree, right? The Holocaust is a fact. It should not be contested. The Armenian Genocide is a fact. There are facts, there is evidence. To say, let's give this person the same space when they are denying it, and this person who maybe survived it, let's give them the same space, and then maybe we can learn something, right? What it ends up doing is saying, we still don't really know, so let's just hear people out. What do you think that does? What do you think that does? If there's someone who's denying the Holocaust occurred, there's someone who literally lived through it, and we're saying, let's give them equal opportunity to just share their perspective. What it's doing is it's trivializing not only the experience, the memory, but the reality of events that occurred, and saying, maybe it didn't, right? Maybe it didn't. It allows for just that little bit where folks go, well, do we know for sure? Do we know for sure? So the reason why I have up here active and passive deniers is I think about this in relation to Beverly Tatum's work. And that clock, I think, is broken, and that's what I've been going off of. So I'm going to go quick. Diana got like maybe 20 minutes or so? Oh, no? Okay. Oh, you're all like, no, let's go. Some of you are like, oh, let me take out my headphone. I can listen to what she has to say now. All right, so the active deniers and passive deniers. So this is my language to try to get a better understanding of this, and it's my language in reference to someone else's language, Beverly Tatum. Some of you might know about Beverly Daniel Tatum. Beverly Daniel Tatum wrote this really amazing book called Why Are All the Black Kids Sitting Together in the Cafeteria? And in the book, she talks about racism. She says racism is a system of advantage based on race. She says if racism is a system of advantage based on race, right, and I don't want to lose you here because I'm not teaching this today, bear with me. She says folks lie on a spectrum in terms of how they benefit and their actions, right? She's specifically talking about white folks in terms of racism. So she tries to say even if white folks aren't actively racist, they still benefit from this system of racism. And she uses this visual, right? She uses this visual of a moving walkway in an airport. And I always think of it as kind of like a bougie, right, bourgeoisie. I think of it as a very like classist example in a sense that like if you've never been to an airport, a larger airport, because my airport surely doesn't have like a moving walkway in Arcata. We have one terminal, like in and out, right? But it's this walkway, you know, if you're in the airport, it's kind of like an escalator, but it's just flat, right? And you're supposed to like get on the right, there's etiquette, right? You stay on the right-hand side. You let people pass you on the left. So I'll do it this way so you can see. All right, so if there's this moving walkway, she says there's active racists. And the active racists, they're on this walkway, and the walkway's already moving. It's moving without you, right? And the active racists, says they get on the walkway, and they're the folks who are walking with their luggage. They're like, I gotta get somewhere, but I'm gonna get on this walkway because it's gonna get me there faster. Some of you know what I'm talking about. You're like, why are you walking? It's moving for you, right? But they're like, I have an agenda, I gotta get somewhere. She says, then there's the passive folks, and the passive folks, they're the folks like me who get on the walkway and I just kind of kick it to the right, like going along for the ride. I'm not actively walking on it, right? I'm just on it for the ride. She says, then, and I'll give you the next one here, there's active anti-racists. She says the active anti-racists, they get on that walkway and they realize they don't want to be on that walkway. And so they turn around on the walkway. The walkway's still moving this way. And I'm actively anti-racist. So I'm trying to go this way, and I'm dodging the people who are just standing there. I'm dodging the people who are really aggressive coming towards me, going like, don't you know the rules, right? So it's a very difficult thing to do, to be actively anti-racist, she says. You're constantly battling. And I thought about this and I went, oh my God, this is like active denial and passive denial. And the goal is we need to be actively anti-deniers. We can't be passive. We have to be active in calling out deniers. And it's a difficult thing to do because you got deniers who are just kicking it, right? They're like, well, maybe it happened, but we don't know for sure, right? And I'm coming up on them like, no, but we do know for sure. Turn around, friend. Come with me, right? They're like, I don't want to get involved. They may not want to get involved, but because it's moving, they're still getting to the end of the line. They're just not actively getting there. They're getting to the same spot, say that the active racists, or I would say the active deniers are getting to, right? They just might get there a little bit slower. They're still going to get there, right? And the goal here isn't to like necessarily to say like who is or who isn't an active denier. We need to know it. We need to call them out. The goal for ourselves, I would argue, right, is how are we acting in our lives to become active anti-deniers? What are we doing to be upstanders, right? And that's the goal. The goal is for us to be active anti-deniers. The only way you can do it is through education. Because if you don't even know that there's a problem to begin with, how do you come together to fix it, right? I mean, think about it. If you don't know there's a problem to begin with, how do you come together to fix it? So you have to hear testimony, right? You have to listen to the people with lived experience. Here's the problem. Those active anti-deniers are going to say, that's not very objective. That's their personal story. They're biased, right? And we need to be able to come at them and say, they lived through it, and their narrative matches the evidence. In fact, their narrative is the evidence. If we think about it in terms of the Armenian Genocide, I would argue that Turkey and Azerbaijan are active deniers, right? Turkey and Azerbaijan are active deniers. So when we think about, let me see. Let me try to put where we're at. Yeah, we have time. So Turkey and Azerbaijan are active deniers. These are two nations that actively state the Armenian Genocide never happened. When you think about the softcore deniers, I would argue that the United States and Israel are softcore deniers of the Armenian Genocide, right? So in the case of the United States kind of skirts around using the term. We don't use the term in official statements, right? We acknowledge that something terrible happened, but we don't use the term and we say, well, leave it up to the historians to decide. In Israel, the government has said, although that there's part of parliament that have decided, yes, the Armenian Genocide took place. I think it was like their sporting group. Yes, the Armenian Genocide took place. The country itself says, we don't agree or disagree. We don't take a stance. And I would argue not taking a stance is taking a stance. It says a lot. However, remember how I said you have to have empathy? And I think about having empathy all the time, not just like for perpetrators. I want to have empathy for the state of Israel, and I'm going to empathize with the state of Israel, again, not excusing or justifying, but understanding politics, geopolitics, understanding regional location, right? Israel is in a very precarious situation in that they are a nation amongst other nations that have outwardly said, we don't want you to exist. So the fact that Israel can have an alliance with Turkey, it makes sense as to why they would not be active anti-deniers. Doesn't excuse it, but we should know about it, right? In the same way that the United States, we're NATO allies with Turkey, right? Turkey says, if you acknowledge the Armenian Genocide, we'll close Incirlik Air Force Base, we won't let you do this, this, and this. And I think that that's a bunch of hogwash, because you have other countries that have acknowledged the Armenian Genocide, I think 29 countries in parliaments, where, you know, Turkey gets upset, maybe removes its ambassador for a the Armenian Genocide. That they recognize the Armenian Genocide. Like I said, 29 countries, European Parliament, the Council of Europe, 48 states in the United States officially recognize the Armenian Genocide. Oh, Alabama, Mississippi, right? Alabama, Mississippi. They don't have very large Armenian populations, but I do wonder what's going to happen when those two states come to their senses, right? They don't want to be the holdouts. And then you have 50 states officially recognizing it, and yet the federal government's like, well, we're still unsure. Let's wait for the historians to decide. One of the largest groupings of historians and genocide scholars, the International Association of Genocide Scholars, has already said, hey guys, yeah, we acknowledge it happened. Okay. This is going to be so good on tape, whoever's taping it. I don't even know what's happening. Technology isn't my strong point. All right, Turkish intellectuals that acknowledge the Armenian Genocide. Like I said, Taner Acem's most recent book. Taner Acem has been charged and convicted under I believe under Article 301, which I'll get to in just a second. And then Ervan Dink. Ervan Dink was an editor of Agos newspaper. It was a Turkish-Armenian newspaper based in Istanbul in 2007. Ervan Dink was assassinated by a 17-year-old Turkish nationalist. And Ervan Dink, for years, had been bringing attention to the Armenian Genocide. He is of Armenian descent, and he had been charged and convicted under Article 301. Again, I'll talk to you about that. That's under the Turkish Penal Code. One cannot denigrate the Turkish nation. Basically, you can't talk smack on Turkey, right? And talking about the Armenian Genocide qualifies. So, you know, what ends up happening is Ervan Dink, he's assassinated in front of Agos newspaper. This is 2007. This is the same time I'm working on my thesis. And I'll get into it if there's time. But he's assassinated, and it comes out shortly after. They caught the young man who did it. He was very proud of what he did. He did it for the Turkish nation. And there's a picture of him at the police station, flanked by two Turkish police officers with the Turkish flag in the background, and they're smiling. Because he just killed Ervan Dink. When this picture came out, you had Turkish, Armenian, everyone basically who had some sense of empathy said, we are all Ervan Dink, right? The gendarme, the police, they don't represent us, right? It's pretty horrendous what happened to Hrant Dink. This happened around the same time. Shortly after that, I was doing my own work, and I got to see firsthand what it's like to meet a denier of the Armenian Genocide. I was like 19 years old in a rural town, basically getting a death threat and going, I'm just writing, I'm just talking. So Taner Achaman and Hrant Dink, you should know about them. Google them. So official policy, what denial looks like. So I mentioned Article 301. I'll talk about it in the next clip. This is the personal kind of individual connection here. Now, a denial takes place, again, through not just individuals denying, but the state denying, right? So denial is official policy. Following the physical destruction of a people and the foundations of their culture, memory is all that is left. And that is targeted as the last victim. Complete annihilation of a people requires the banishment of recollection and the suffocation of remembrance. Deny, deny, deny. And if you deny long enough, the denial will become truth. We are now 103 years after the Armenian Genocide, and the Republic of Turkey spends millions of dollars denying that the events ever took place. They deny through official documentation in their own country. They deny by creating professorships around the world in institutions that could be researching, right? They deny with their own education system in Turkey. So in Turkey, if you were to grow up learning about the Armenian Genocide, you just wouldn't. Right? You'd learn that the Armenians were traitors. You would learn that maybe some Armenians died, but more Turks died at the hands of Armenians. Complete distortion, not just distortion, but erasure of actual events. And this isn't something new, right? These are policies that have been in place and are continuously in place in Turkey. So when I talk about denial as a personal individual response, I think that in order for us to understand denial as official policy, we have to understand denial as a personal individual response, because if the institution is educating the people, how can we expect the people to know anything other than what they are learning? It's kind of like when youth grow up in the United States or even in California. I think, you know, students still do in 4th grade, they still have the mission project in California. That's pretty horrendous when you think about indigenous children in the state of California completing these mission projects and not learning that these missions were built on the backs of indigenous labor and slavery. So, you know, learning what you learn as a youth, right? And then having it reinforced as you go through the years, and then you get to maybe university and someone's telling you something different, it's really easy for that cognitive dissonance, right? That break in harmony. What you're thinking doesn't align with what you're seeing or what you're hearing. You can be really frustrated by it. And I've met folks from Turkey who come to the United States who have no knowledge of the Armenian Genocide. None whatsoever. In fact, they say, well, you know, the Armenians were siding with the Russians. What? Right? But their story is totally different. And so when I say empathy, I have no ill will towards the people of Turkey. Right? When I talk about being an anti-denier, right, it's important to educate, but I'm talking about look at what the state is doing, right, to promote these narratives, these false narratives. And I think we need to hold the state accountable. So this personal individual, this is I'm going to go through this kind of quick, but I wanted to write it in its entirety. I know you're not supposed to do a lot of font, but I'm going to read this off to you. This is what I saw after I was doing research, and there were these Armenian Genocide survivors. They were giving this testimony, and I found this website, and I wanted to utilize it, and I wrote them back, and it was a reputable educational site. I said, this is my name, this is my address, this is what I do, this is my idea, this is what I believe. I believe that the United States, complicit in the distortion of history with the Republic of Turkey. Can I utilize these testimonies? How would I cite them? Within a few days, I go back to the site, and this is what I see. This is written, and above it, there's a picture of these Turkish stormtroopers in full-on like riot gear, right? With the Turkish flag kind of flowing, right? So kind of get a visual here. And back then, you didn't think to like screenshot stuff, you know what I mean? So let me read this. What says, this is how it was written, I didn't change it, right? What says your freedom and human right ideas do not curse our religion, never make treachery to our country, otherwise we will erase all of your sites from the internet. We hope that you meet with terrorists and your police and soldiers are killed by terrorists, and then maybe you can understand us. After now, you have no chance to make a mistake about Turkey. If you make a mistake about Turkey, you will see our hard reaction. We will never stop for hacking your sites. We hate from anybody who curses our police, soldiers, prime ministers, and we will show our reaction as soon as to them, because we are in the service of the Turk nations. This is cited directly 3/14/07. Hrant Dink was assassinated in January of 2007. Shortly after this, I received an email. You can Google it, right? We contacted the FBI because I started receiving threats. On my computer, my firewall, I didn't know about this, my firewall was down, documents were gone. You can't make this up. And I'm freaking out. Y'all are students, you know this, right? I didn't delete it. Why would I delete it? And I went to a computer store, and we're in a rural area, so it's not like you can go to Apple. And I went to the computer store, I said, what's going on? They said, well, you obviously deleted work. I said, I wouldn't delete anything. Where's everything? Things are missing. And as I am talking to the worker, he's like, something's remote. What? And my father works for the government, and I'm like, what is going on? My father's not like high level, right? But he works for the government so that when I talked to my professor and I said, this is what's happening, and Sam Oliner, right, survivor of the Holocaust, he listens to me. I'm like, I don't want to do this because I'm getting emails, and one of the emails said, you are Maral Attallah. You live at 1060 J Street, Arcata, California. All of your windows and doors are open. What? I go to my advisor, I say, I can't do this, I'm not doing it. And I'm crying to him. I'm like, I don't know what to do. He says, you got to call the FBI. So we call the FBI. The FBI goes, we're aware of the situation. I'm worried because my dad works for the government. They're like, well, what was on your computer? And I was like, I'm just talking about the Armenian Genocide. I don't know if you're aware, but Turkey denies it. We are well aware. Even when I called and I said, I'm Maral Attallah, right? And I said something like, and I'm supposed to go to Turkey. The responses are very like, we are aware. We are aware. And I was like, oh my God, what are you aware of, right? And I'm like, this is before like Edward Snowden, right? Where you're like, what? How do you know me? I'm just like in a rural town, right? We are aware. And so they opened up an investigation. I had to tell my friends, don't joke about it. Don't send me emails because anything I get is going straight to the FBI. And I'm talking to Sam, and he says to me, and he's drinking his tea, right? And he goes, are you finished? And I go, yes, I think I'm done with that. I'm like crying, I'm like, I don't want to do this. He goes, you can't quit. They want you to quit. That's what they want you to do. When a survivor of the Holocaust tells you to suck it up, you suck it up, right? In that moment, I'm thinking like, oh my God, I'm so sorry that I put this burden on you. Of course, right? I'm 19, I'm freaking out. They know my address. Who are they? This is the start. This is not finished. The emails haven't finished, phone calls haven't finished. I anticipate when I give talks like this, someone will stand up. I gave a talk in Portland. In the middle of my talk, someone stood up. You're wrong. I'm not, though. And I let them talk, and they said, I'm from Turkey. Let's go to Article 301. I'm from Turkey. I've never heard of this Article 301 that says you can't denigrate Turkishness, because it used to be denigrate Turkishness, right? Then they wanted to join the EU, so they're like, okay, we'll change some things up, so it's not denigrate Turkishness. Now it's like, you can't denigrate the Turkish nation. Right? We'll change some words. He says, I've never heard this. I teach in Turkey. And I go, okay. And mind you, and it was crazy, because as fate would have it, Sam Oliner is sitting in the front row. At that point, he's probably in his late 70s. And I see him kind of posture like he's going to get up and like defend my honor. And I'm like, got this, Sam. So the guy's talking, and I say, okay, sir, so you teach in Turkey. I said, and what topics do you teach? Well, I teach math. Fair to say, you probably aren't going to be talking about politics or history in math. Well, I've never heard of it. Okay, well, I'm not making it up. It literally is in their Turkish penal code, right? Article 301, one cannot denigrate Turkishness. And like I said, individuals have been charged and convicted under this. This doesn't bode well for a nation that wants to be a democratic nation, right? And allowing free speech and freedom of expression. Okay, so motives for denial during genocide. So there's motives for denial during genocide and after genocide. Right here I give you a picture under perpetrators' desire to continue oppressive rule. Aung San Suu Kyi, who's the first counselor of Myanmar. If you go back to when I talk about active and passive deniers, I would say that Aung San Suu Kyi floats. She floats between the two. You'll see right next to it, it says bystanders avoid moral and legal obligations to act. There's a picture of President Bill Clinton. This is in July 1994. I chose this picture because I don't know if you can see, but there's a map, right? And then there's supposed to be a dot where Rwanda is. Just so you know, Rwanda is a country on the African continent. Africa is a continent, not a country. Just want to throw that out there for folks. So the reason why I include Aung San Suu Kyi, right, because she claims after the UN says ethnic cleansing is taking place in Myanmar, Myanmar used to be called Burma, it's now Myanmar, she says, I don't think ethnic cleansing is taking place. Now she's a leader, the equivalent to, we don't have parliament here, but like, what's the head of parliament? The prime minister. So there's an equivalent of the prime minister here, right? In Myanmar, you basically have military control of all of the operations. So whether it's protection of the borders, right? So what folks are saying is like, well, she can't really say anything because she doesn't really have the power. Wrong. She is a head of state. She is a recipient of the Nobel Peace Prize. She has a voice. And when she was under house arrest for like 20 years, she used that voice, right? Now she's in a position to possibly do more than she could do in the past, and she's kind of gotten a little wishy-washy on it. She says, Muslims have been targeted, but Buddhists have also been subjected to violence. In December 2016, she implies that people are exaggerating the severity of the violence against the Rohingya. In 2017, she says, I don't think there's ethnic cleansing going on. I think ethnic cleansing is too strong of an expression to use for what is happening. I think there's a lot of hostility there. It's Muslims killing Muslims as well if they think they're cooperating with the authorities. So here you have an example where denial during, perpetrators are denying during because they want to continue their oppressive rule, right? And one could say, well, she doesn't personally seem like an oppressive person. She heads a state that is committing not just oppressive acts, genocidal acts. And I will state that, genocide, right? We can't sit with just ethnic cleansing when we have the evidence, right? It's like unfolding. It's like you almost can't even believe that people are like, well, it's almost like there's stages. It's like, well, let's call it this for a little while. Let's wait, let it marinate, and then maybe we'll call it this. Again, deny, 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 and if you deny long enough, right, that denial becomes truth. So the bystanders avoid moral legal obligation. I say this for President Bill Clinton. This is during the Rwandan genocide. It's also known as the genocide against the Tutsi. I think that that's becoming a more well-known, well-used phrase, right? Genocide against the Tutsi rather than Rwandan genocide. But just for the sake of you understanding what I'm talking about, I'll say Rwandan genocide. You have a situation where, hopefully you know this, the United States government, we didn't act. We didn't want to act. In fact, we said, not only are we not sending in troops as the head of the UN Security Council, we're not giving any funding for anyone else to send in troops. After you have the killing of 10 peacekeepers, right, it was pretty clear that any out that a nation could have, if the United States says, well, you don't really have to if you don't want to, nations were going to say, we don't really want to, right? And the argument is that, we didn't want another Somalia on our hands. If you all have, watched movies, there's a film about what happened in Somalia. It's a Hollywood film, but a film nonetheless, called Black Hawk Down, right? And I think the government didn't trust the people of the US to make a statement for themselves, to say, we understood what happened to those soldiers, right, in Somalia was horrendous, right? But that shouldn't stop us from helping to stop a genocide. We weren't even given that option. In fact, the President Clinton said, this was one of his biggest regrets, and it's like, good, it should be, because his argument is still, we just didn't know enough in time. We just didn't know. You are the President of the United States. You are getting cables that are saying, this is what's going to happen, this is what's happening. We just didn't know, right? And he says, when we finally realized the gravity of the situation, it was too late. The Rwandan genocide was roughly 100 days. It was the fastest, most efficient killing spree of the 20th century. About 800,000 Tutsi and moderate Hutu were killed, not through the routinization mechanisms of gas chambers, not by the majority of a bullet, by hatchets and knives by their neighbors. 800,000 people in 4 months. Think about your summer. Your summer break is roughly 3 months. What happened to the Tutsi, what happened to the Armenians, roughly falls on the same scale of the sheer violence in a short period of time. He says, when we finally found out, it was too late. And I say, give me a break. It's never too late. It's never too late to step in. Because if you step in on day 99, guess what happens? The people who were massacred on day 100 are alive. It's never too late. Motives for denial after genocide, this is kind of basic, right? Reparations, right? The perpetrating individuals, they don't want to give reparations. They don't want to give land. They don't want to give money, right? Germany is probably a really great example of the right way to respond, even though it's still sort of problematic in relation to folks who are identified as homosexual, but that's another lecture for another time. But Germany made reparations, Wiedergutmachung, which essentially translates roughly in my terrible German, right? Translates to make good again, right, in English, right, reparations. There's a really great study that was chaired by Henry Theriault. Henry Theriault is a professor, but he's also the current president of the International Association of Genocide Scholars. Bystanders' loss of political and economic interests, right? And this is kind of basic, right? It's no longer about what we can gain, right? Denial during genocide, because you deny during genocide if you have no political or economic interests. It was said during the Rwandan genocide, there was a diplomat who responds to a survivor who says, and he's basically echoing Henry Kissinger, right? He says, the US doesn't have friends, it only has interests, right? In asking why the US wasn't stepping in during Rwanda. So after genocide, it's no longer about what we can gain, what can we lose? You see this in relation to present day situation with Darfur, Sudan, and recently with the South African government, right, deciding to not arrest Omar al-Bashir when he was in South Africa, Johannesburg, attending the African Union summit. And they're like, should we not? It'd be terrible. He's here on our soil, right? This is an individual who has been charged in 2009, right, with genocide, war crimes, and yet they're like, well, should we not, right? And the ICC, the International Criminal Court, was like, yeah, you should have. This kind of goes into another point kind of towards the end, and I'll try to get through it really quick. There's no deterrence to commit genocide or genocide denial, right? There's just no deterrence. And that's where we come in. That's where the people come in. And they say to their governments, not on our watch, not in our name. So I'm going to kind of go through this sort of quickly. There's the outcomes of genocide denial. So there's impacts on the social psychological well-being, and I would say not just on the victims, right? But this impacts the perpetrators. This impacts the survivors, children, right? This is intergenerational trauma for folks who were the targeted groups and folks who were potentially the perpetrators. There's a really great piece that came out in 2015. It was called The Century of Silence. It was from the New Yorker, and I would recommend you looking it up. And here's an example where you have the Kurdish population in Diyarbakir, right? Historic Armenia, present-day Eastern Turkey, the Kurdish population apologizing for what their ancestors did during the Armenian Genocide. Can you imagine? Now, if you understand current politics, you understand, was it a genuine apology? Was it not, right? Because it also benefits the Kurdish population in Turkey to have support from the Armenian diaspora. Why? Because the current Kurdish population in Turkey is a marginalized population. In fact, a saying went, because the Kurds were used to help commit genocide against the Armenians. There's a statement that says, Armenians say to Kurds, Turks ate Armenians for breakfast. The Turks are going to eat you for lunch. Meaning, you may be doing this to us and you think you're going to benefit and you're going to get our houses and you're going to get the land and you'll be free because there's no more Christians here. You're being used, right? But I think that it's really important, whether it's a genuine apology or not, it's an actual recognition and it's acknowledgement. No deterrence to commit genocide or genocide denial. Here you have a picture, this is 2017, Turkish president laughs off demand to arrest the Sudan leader. So here is, Here is Omar al-Bashir, right? He's the president of Sudan. Genocide is ongoing in Sudan. We're like 15 years out, right? And then here is Erdogan. And so, Erdogan had said some years ago, he's quoted as saying, there's no way that genocide is being committed in Sudan because Muslims don't commit genocide. They're buddies. They're allies, right? So when he was asked, hey, are you going, we hear that, I forget what event it was. They said, the ICC said, are you gonna arrest him? And he laughs it off. And he laughs it off because he says, something like this makes you laugh. Erdogan was quoted as saying, are we going to just go and hand over to you someone who's a member of the OIC? It's the Organization of Islamic Cooperation Summit that's taking part. He says, what kind of understanding is this? It's impossible to understand it. We just laughed it off. He noted that Turkey isn't a signatory to the International Criminal Court, so they are not bound by the rules of the International Criminal Court. He's like, we're not arresting him. We don't really care about your laws. Just to make note, the United States is also, we're not a signatory to the ICC. Well, we've basically said, like, we don't agree with the ICC. We won't be cooperating with you. It's not great company to be in, right? And again, this goes back to even the Genocide Convention. Can you think of why the U.S. government would not want to be, held under the pressure of the ICC, right? We don't want to be held accountable for our own war crimes or potential war crimes or acts of genocide, et cetera. All right, so moving towards reconciliation and resolution, there's no reconciliation or resolution without recognition and reparation. I put the R and the E in parentheses here because Henry Theriault in that, the piece that I showed you prior, he makes a really good point, or they make a really good point. They say you can't, reconciliation implies that there was a conciliatory relationship to begin with, right? So we're kind of low on time, so I'm not going to go too deep into it, but just this idea of apology and forgiveness, right? I think sometimes people think that you need to apologize and then forgiveness comes next. And I always tell folks, you should apologize because you genuinely feel bad for what you've done, not because you want forgiveness for what you've done. And I think with this idea of reconciliation, there's not even talk for reconciliation or any type of resolution if there's not a recognition of what had happened and reparations. And I want to be really clear here. Just recognizing it isn't enough, right? Because what can end up happening is, say the current Republic of Turkey, they recognize it, and they say, yeah, we recognize that this happened. What then does that mean for the next, the incoming government to say, and we rescind, right? They weren't in their right mind, right? So there has to be something substantial that's attached to it. And you know, the Treaty of Sèvres, the Treaty of Lausanne, right? I mean, you can look at reparations for the Armenian population and what that might mean. And then I ask you to become active anti-deniers. And I think that that's really important. You know, so I don't know how much time we have. I don't know, let me see. I'll just kind of skirt through this. So let me just tell you really quick. President Barack Obama, he said, if he was elected president, I'll just read to you. If I'm elected president, I will acknowledge the Armenian Genocide. This is when he's a senator, right? I will call it by its rightful name, blah, 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 whatever. 2009 rolls around. I've consistently stated my own view of what occurred in 1915, and my view of all that history has not changed. My interest remains the achievement of a full, frank, and just acknowledgement of the facts. Are you going to use the term genocide in your yearly statement? No. But we know that his opinion hasn't changed. 2010 to 2016, he invokes Zygielbaum, right, as a substitute for genocide. This is really troubling to me because this is the term that Armenians use, right? The great calamity, the great catastrophe. So not just adding like insult to injury by not following through with your promise, you're now using our word, right? That's like dog whistle, like, y'all know what I mean. I'm using your language. Are we cool? Am I cool now? Did I hold it down for you Armenians who probably came in mass to vote for me? And not just for that issue, but you better believe, right? When Samantha Power comes out and she says, and he'll, you know, she's talking to Armenian populations, this is our guy, he's gonna do it. Armenians were like, this is our guy, he's gonna do it. So my response, so in 2015, CNN runs a headline, Obama won't call Armenian Genocide 100th anniversary an atrocity. Oh, it should say, I wrote it wrong. But he's not gonna call it a genocide, right? So April 22nd, I wrote a letter to the president urging him to keep his promise and acknowledge the Armenian Genocide. I vowed to contact the president once a week, reminding him of his promise, stating that I wouldn't stop until either he used the term or he reached his term limit. Between April 21, 2015, January 10, 2017, I wrote and called or emailed the White House 97 times. And then I get interviewed in a conference, 2015, makes international news. This is July 9th. I'm leaving Abu Dhabi. July 24th, I was detained and asked all sorts of questions. My traveling companion was even asked in the US Customs portion, because I was detained at 2 parts. Were you traveling with Maral Attallah the entire trip? Did you leave the borders of Armenia? At any point, did she leave the borders of Armenia? And they're like asking these questions. Okay, cool. I get a fellowship to the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. I'm going in the summer. I want to tour the White House. I get this. And what's great is, this is July 14th, and like a week later, I'm invited to talk with then California Senator Barbara Boxer. I got a picture with her. It's almost like we planned it. Our blouses are the same, where I thank her for acknowledging the Armenian Genocide. I can get through that security. I can get through the security of the Holocaust Memorial Museum, but I can't get into the White House. It's kind of like a badge of honor, maybe, I don't know. I'm gonna leave you with this image. Technology is amazing in so many ways. You can get so much information. You can also find out a lot about people, and creepers can find out a lot about you. In fact, if you were to probably Google me, you could find out where my office is. You could even probably find out where I live, right? You could find out where my office hours are, right? If you dig deep enough, where I teach class, right? Man, you could probably find out where I park my car, right? So what ends up happening with this is a text that I received. This is the end of the text. I'm the blue, by the way. My sister went to go test drive a car. She thought that the salesman was too aggressive. She goes to test drive, I think it was a Mercedes or a Lexus. She's like, he's too aggressive, I don't want to, right? Deal with him. She's like, he's harassing me. She gave him a different email. She gave him an email that didn't work, but he had her number because she had, you're applying for a car, you got to drive, right? For the test drive or whatever. So anyways, long story short, this guy Googles my sister because he really wants to make the sale. And in the process of Googling her, because if you Google my sister's name, my name pops up on page 2. She was under my phone plan too. This is kind of crazy. Her name pops up because my name pops up because I recognize her in one of the pieces that I wrote. Then I pop up, and the piece that I wrote, right, is where I'm calling out Turkey for the Armenian Genocide. This guy's Turkish. He no longer wants to sell the car to my sister, right? He now wants to come after me. I pretend to not be my sister, not know who he's talking about. I mean, this is like going on. And then finally, after no silence, I go, I don't know who you're talking about, sorry. He sends me this picture. And you can't see, but about 5 minutes later, sorry, not meant for you. I looked the guy up. I got creepy and I got on his Facebook. I'm like, this guy's creepy. Super ethnic nationalist, Turkish nationalist. And this was my response. Please delete my number. I'm not sure who you are or why you are sending this to me. Because my response is I don't know you. And I'm not going to give you any opportunity to try to continue to contact me. So key points to remember: no reconciliation or resolution without recognition and reparation. Indifference kills. Choose to be an active denier. And as you can see from my last picture, it's not an easy thing to do. Thank you all so much.